Today's selection is an adult and baby turtle on top of lily pads. Arizona topaz. I start by coloring the bottom of the shells this muted yellow color. Next, I do the spots on their legs in the same color. I do the front of both of their necks, their chins, and their noses the same color. French green. I color the remainder of their skin French green. I go back and touch up the areas I did in Arizona topaz. Sarasota orange. I add color and dimension to the yellow areas using Sarasota orange. I use little pressure and add layers of color until I get to the desired shade. I color all the areas where a shadow would be. Use my example of placement. I do all around the yellow spots in this color as well. deep chrome green. I begin adding shading to the green areas of their skin using this darker green. I place it anywhere I think a shadow would be cast and where they have wrinkles. I do all around the yellow spots in this color as well. This color is called roan red. It's a dark brownish red. I use it to make the areas shaded with orange pop. Emerald green. This pretty green will be the base color for the edges of the shells. I use a lot of pressure and saturate the shells in this color. I do the tops of their heads in the same color. Pastel green. I put the base color on the leaves using this pale green. Emerald green. I add some dimension and color to the leaves by adding this darker shade. Deep chrome green. I shade the leaves in areas I think appropriate. I try to imagine where sunlight coming from above would hit the leaves and where it wouldn't. The areas I imagine would not be in direct sunlight, I shade with this darker green. Navy blue. I use navy blue to add shading to the trim of the shells. Once again, I imagine shaded areas and areas that would be in direct light. If you're unsure of where to place this color, you can watch my example. Now I add shading to the head, including in the ridges. I begin coloring the top of the shells navy blue. I decide the blue is too dark, so I erase as much as I can. Emerald green. I then color over the area I just erased with emerald green. I then go back to navy blue and do the shading on the top of the shell. I do in the ridges using a bit of pressure, then lighten my pressure on the crayon as I move away from the ridge. I alternate between navy blue and emerald green and finish the shells. Bluebird. If you're following along, I suggest waiting to color the eyes, as I end up not liking the color, so I erase and change it. You may like this color, so you may want to do something similar, or you may want to do it the color I settle on, after erasing. Emerald green. Maybe blue. I found a small eraser and I erased as much of the blue I'd just put on the eyes as possible. Sarasota orange. I repair the areas around the eyes that I damaged accidentally when erasing. A metallic silver called Belgian block. Because I need to cover a little bit of blue that remains, I choose one of my metallic colored pencil crayons, as they tend to cover over flaws quite well. I do the eyes in this color and like the result better than the blue. I use navy blue to do the small area in the eyeball that I think is supposed to be the colored part of the eye. Bright violet. I looked up lily pads, so I had an idea of their coloring, and I noticed some of them had a purple tone around their perimeter, so I decided to add that to a couple of mine. This is optional, of course. Orchid mist. I use a paler purple inside of the bright violet as I think it will blend into the green I will be using next better. French green. I use a lot of pressure on the crayon to solidly cover the rest of the lily pads in a light green that will act as the base layer. I apologize as I didn't center my page under the camera well, so I missed some of my coloring. I'm still learning, but I promise to get better. Emerald green. I add shadows and shape to the lily pads with an emerald green that is darker than the base color. I color where the picture's artist added lines to signify shadows and ridges on the lily pads. If you're unsure of where to place this color, use my artwork as an example. Notice I also put this color around the perimeter of the lily pads. In the pictures I saw, the lily pads were darker around the edges. Green. I use this shade of green on the lily pads where I think darker shading is needed. Once again, if you're unsure of where to place it, follow my example. Bluebird. I do the edge of the ripples in this pretty blue color. Verdian green. I use this color to add dimension to the ripples. I place it on the inside of the blue color. I decide to use this pink called cerise to add some background color. I want a light dusting of color, so I don't use much pressure on the pencil. I don't add this color to the items in the water. I use sky magenta to add brighter color closest to the objects in the picture. Once again, I don't add this color near the items in the water. I use a fine point pen to do all of the black areas on the picture. I trade up for a slightly thicker felt marker to do the larger lines. I apologize as I didn't have the page centered for all of the outlining. I'm simply tracing along all the black areas on the coloring page. I've gone back to my finest point felt pen. I will trade back to the thick one when I fill in the eyes, but I stick to the fine point for the remainder of the outlining. Notice that I don't reline the ripple lines. You may do them optionally. And that's it! We're done!